Good morning, Rahul and Nyrika. Thank you so much for joining in here today. As you both know, we are here to talk about conscious living, and we're going to talk about the conscious living event that you're hosting for the first time as part of Godrej Design Lab. So I'm going to dive right in. In your opinion, what does consciousness mean to you? As a definition, conscious basically means an awareness of both internal and external existence. So maybe Rahul, if you can maybe start off first. What does consciousness mean to you as an individual and as an architect?
So consciousness, I think, means being aware of what's around you, and an awareness that's both physical, but also perhaps spiritual and mental in a sense. And it is about really thinking in ecological terms. When I mean ecology, I mean an interconnectedness, right? And I think to be conscious of the fact that you are interconnected to a much larger set of beings and conditions is very critical. So as an architect, when you think ecologically, you create interesting feedback loops, because I might be designing a green building in Borivali in Mumbai, but I might be extracting materials to make it green elsewhere where I'm causing forms of displacement. If I'm not conscious of that, I've negated my intentions of making something green, for example. And so this sense of interconnectedness is very critical. And I think for me, as an architect, well, as a human being, I think consciousness is about being aware of this notion of interconnectedness. We are all interconnected, and what we do has an impact on others and vice versa. And how we create an equilibrium and an harmony within that broader ecology that we exist in is, I think, being conscious.
I like how you define it and equate it with interconnectedness, because I feel when we talk about conscious living, that word gets lost in the background sometimes. So maybe, Nyrika, maybe you can address that. Does interconnectedness factor in what you think what conscious living is or what consciousness is? Maybe you can expand on that.
Very much so. I think it's an integral part of consciousness, because we don't live in isolation, and sometimes we tend to think of ourselves as islands, and we ignore the larger impact that all of our actions has. And I think that intentionality is something that we believe is very important, and it's something that we tend to lose in the busyness of everyday life. And it's kind of a call to recenter and really think about, our impact, and also the circle in terms of everything comes back. So I think, and Rahul, you also touched upon the idea that in a community, we all influence one another, and looking at it from the ecological perspective today is very critical, because we tend to always put a monetary value on things, to really understand their value, but not so much on the ecological front. And if we're able to be more intentional and really look at the values of living in a larger society and a world, I think that's really the underlying idea behind consciousness.
In fact,
Speaking of,
in fact, that's really well put, because I'm just thinking how you can take something as big as this notion of consciousness and then break it down so that as designers, as entrepreneurs, we can actually be responsive to it, right? Because we have to finally be able to act, in a sense. And so as you were sort of articulating your position, I was just thinking, how does one break it then to, say, social consciousness, and then what that might mean? And that might mean about how we treat people who might be apart from us. We create forms of diversity and plurality. How, economic classes can begin to commingle, and there architecture and design plays a massive role, because architecture can brutally separate people or integrate them, correct? How one creates thresholds, as I say, thresholds can be very hard or thresholds can be very soft, and they can be porous, whether it's just visual, whether it's even an illusion of equity. It's what design can bring, and that's about social consciousness. And you can break it down as cultural consciousness. If culture are the implicit rules in society, because there's no handbook of culture, right? People say that you have to go and live somewhere for 3 years to understand the culture of the place, because you understand the implicit rules society has. And cultural consciousness then allows you to operate within that society with the awareness that respects those implicit rules. And so it'll be interesting how one can take this idea and actually break it down in a way that we as designers, entrepreneurs, citizens can actually sort of act and be aware of it. So, just your thoughts just triggered that off.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but interesting values or interesting thoughts that are already emerging from what you're sharing. What Nyrika mentioned was, of course, about the power of influence and the power of creating an ecosystem of values. Speaking of which, can you share your vision behind why you chose to set up Conscious Collective at this time, right? There is, of course, Conscious Collective is a marriage of not just these values and these influences, but it's also a larger context of what Rahul rightly positioned as cultural consciousness and social consciousness. So maybe can you talk about why you set up Conscious Collective and why also attach it to a trends report?
Yes,
if you can
absolutely.
Maybe highlight that,
So I think the idea behind Conscious Collective is really to build a community, and it's not that the community is, is something that is created. It's something that already exists, but bringing people together to really, and as you rightly said, it can develop. We wanted to develop and evolve over the years, but we thought, the first Conscious Collective would be centered on spaces, because today our cities coming from a country like India that's developing so rapidly, and many of these trade-offs are very apparent. And how do we really build our spaces with more intentionality? And on the materials front, how do we really look at materials that are circular in nature, that have less impact on the planet, and how do we really explore newer materials? And of course, the third very key pillar is the environment, which kind of underpins both of the first two pillars in a manner of speaking. And I think the trends report was really an idea to kind of look at research and to look at how conscious living trends are manifesting in India today, and very importantly, how are we looking to traditional techniques to learn from, and also to, because so much of our traditional knowledge is getting lost these days, and how do we really kind of regain an understanding of those traditional techniques, and how do we really marry it with modern technology innovation to look at new materials? And I think the idea again of progress and development on the one hand, conservation on the other hand, and how do we not have polarized discussions, because the discussions have to be had with sensitivity, balancing the trade-offs, and trying to have different conversations to optimize. And I think also this whole idea of authenticity and how we can be true to ourselves and true to our purpose also, because I think that's also an important aspect that's also come from our research, that the Gen Z are very purpose-driven, or more purpose-driven maybe than we were or we are, and the importance of public-private partnerships and the importance of companies today to shape consumer preferences.
Yeah.
And I think it really comes down to bringing all these things together and to really highlighting our sense of responsibility for each of us to have collective action.
Yeah. I think what I really appreciate is the fact that there is a union, that there's finally a union of how design and architecture plays a role in adapting to all of these choices that you just mentioned, whether it's a search for authenticity or whether it's digging for new materials or discovery of new materials and their purpose. So I really like that this initiative ties everything together really well without having to force fit the role of any of these individual entities. Yes, Rahul, you wanted to add? Yeah.
I'm going to pause to respond to two things
yes,
you said.
Sure,
Okay.
Yes.
So, I mean, again, I think just responding almost like a jugalbandi to different perspectives from the point of an architect.
Yeah.
Listening to your comments about the kind of nuanced approach we have to take to be effective. For young architects, I sort of often think and say that in today's world, what's happening is really our spheres of concern, rightly so, are exponentially expanding. We're going all the way from worrying about the planet to appropriate materials to a whole host of social, political, ideological questions.
Right.
And so this sphere of concern it's just huge.
Yeah.
But what has happened simultaneously is our sphere of influence has diminished. And it's become so little that you have cynicism and frustration. And so I think the challenge for the future, and this is where consciousness, the notion of consciousness is very critical to calibrate how we bring into some synchrony our sphere of concern and our sphere of influence. Because if those map upon each other in equal proportion, we are really effective.
How do you get them in the same orbit?
And they have to come in through a sense of consciousness. So what I mean by that, for young architects, you can spend a whole evening talking about climate change, inequity, this, that, and the other. You get up in the morning and you're doing a little addition for some developer to a building or repairing something so mundane that you feel, my God, how does this even connect? And therefore, how we begin to become conscious about our environment, about what our aspirations should be, is one way to begin to engage with the kind of projects, the kind of making, the kind of craft, the kind of imaginaries for the world that will help these come together. So this balance between our spheres of concern and influence is going to be a very critical challenge for young architects or the next generation of architects. And I think thinking through this lens of consciousness could be a very important way to create these calibrations.
Right, yeah.
Second point I want to make is just
they're
all
ahead.
related to what she said,
ahead.
but so it might help you intersperse this. Is, as an architect, then it all comes down to the client. And I say, well, my client wants me to do this, right? But then again, I think that's an interesting challenge because we can pause and say, who is my client, right?
Yeah.
And as I described from my own experience, that every project, be it this building we're sitting in, a factory, a home, they are, just for simplicity, three clients, right? It's the patron client who has the vision and has the money. There's an operational client who actually operates this, and there's a user client who's going to use it, right? In a single family home, these collapse into one entity, and that's why architects love doing weekend homes and single family houses. They do their best work because there's least resistance. If I look at a university or I look at a government campus for housing, then you have a chief minister or the president of the university who has a vision, and then you have an operational campus engineer who's got other concerns, and then you have a user client, could be students, could be low-income families living in the housing, etc. Who is your client, right? You can complicate that and say, you can go all the way to the planet becoming your client, and then your concerns get even more complicated,
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
And so we have to find new ways, new lenses, new values that we can actually traverse this entire spectrum, because the architect's role is really to bring all those disparate entities and values that you think are your client, that should be your client, on the same side of the table. And often the conflicts, the messiness in projects come from the fact that those aspirations differ. So therefore, how does one actually do this, right? I think the first sort of thing to think about is values. Values are critical. Values are a common denominator that can bring people together because it is linked to aspirations. Our aspirations have to be similar. So how we create the narratives about that comes from the idea of consciousness. If we understand consciousness as being the sense of interconnectedness, then we are aware of that. So it begins to inform the values that we bring. But I think, speaking more prosaically as an architect, then I think the question is really the models of practice, the ways that we engage, right? And the models of practice can go all the way from a model where someone's working directly with a craftsperson, like Laurie Baker, the great architect, did, to a corporation that has 500 people and they're abstracting their decisions. I think architects have to engage with those models simultaneously, depending on the client, depending on the problem. And I think that has become a real limitation within the profession, where there is one standard universalizing approach, not only of values but also of ways of engagement. And multiple ways of engagement is one way of doing that for all aspects of the client, but also for the architect. Then the architect can begin to speak to a much broader constituency and bring them on the same table.
But that is not always a luxury for the architect nor for the client, right? Especially when it comes to collaborative, like for instance, when Henry prompted by saying that, how does a corporate angle fit in here in terms of collaboration and in terms of meaningful collaboration? A lot of times the architect's vision is a certain approach, right? In terms of, say, meeting standards, in terms of, say, realizing their vision in its actuality. But where does the interruption happen? The interruption happens because of a corporate entity and their vision, because of a contractor's vision, because of these other entities that need to come together. So how does that union or that orbit align?
Well, one is we don't have the time for luxury, and that's why I think values. That means I think it's contingent upon the architect. What are architects? What does society? Society invests in doctors to keep our health better. Society invests in architects to imagine better spatial possibilities where we can live healthier, more equitable lives full of conscious awareness about our interconnectedness, right? That's what society invests in us to do. We have to assert ourselves to bring that value to society. So I don't think it's about a client dictating something. I think it's contingent upon the architect to reimagine, re-articulate those narratives. And I think things will, and it's equally contingent on a client to bring those values and to re-articulate those positions. You use the word standards. What does that even mean? Whose standards? Where do the standards come from? I mean, that's part of colonization, that's part of hegemonies of capitalism from around the world. We have to question this at all levels, and therefore, through different models of engagement, whether it's the model of, let's call it the barefoot architect, or the model of corporate organizations, they've all got to meet together on values, and I think that's the critical thing.
Who sets these values? Who puts these values together? Is that again a collaborative effort, or does it have to be dictated by a power and authority? What do you think would work in the context of a complex ecosystem that is India?
So, well, it of course depends on political ideologies. Sorry, I'm just going on, but
please,
so just stop
please
me.
feel free.
Just don't jump in. I feel bad. That's all exciting. And
Please, it's very, very.
So there, standards are set in two ways. You can determine them in a political ideology, an autocracy versus a democracy. We are concerned about India, so let's look at a democracy. So therefore, it's about consensus building. It's about ratification, but it has to be a process, right? So the question is, who imagines the standards? And I believe my profession of architects has been incredibly lazy about imagining these standards. This is where research, archiving, education, all of that comes into place. We've just taken standards from the West. I mean, you look at the green standards, you look at the LEED standards. Now we have GREA, so therefore it's a way we've indigenized it. But if you look at the LEEDs, it's a hegemony of the of a green industry, right? So what do? You can make the dumbest box, and then you can double seal it, double glaze it, have fantastic mechanical systems, and you get a LEED certificate. That's the hegemony of the green industry, right? We should be actually talking about passive heating and cooling and cross ventilation and all of that, right? So those standards come from elsewhere, and so it's contingent on the profession to imagine these standards, right? And these are cultural changes and changes in cultures of accountability. You know, what's fascinating for me is traditional Chinese medicine. In traditional Chinese medicine, you pay a doctor every month. When you fall sick, you stop paying him till you're well.
Really?
You know, we need cultural approaches like that. That's accountability.
Yeah, that's accountability. I think
and it's also, sorry, just,
go
to,
ahead.
to interject here, to your point about standards, I think something which is an interesting example from the Godrej Boyce context is this whole idea of recycled concrete and the perception, or rather misperception, that it's less durable than virgin material. And also the building codes being so strict about what is an acceptable material, and how do we really change some of these codes which are, which have existed for so many years, maybe haven't been revisited, and how do we really, given the fact that infrastructure projects are large scale, given the fact that buildings are coming up all over the city, would it be possible to think about circularity when we're looking at these kind of materials, and how do we really influence the building codes to look at things like this?
That's an absolutely excellent point. In fact, when we look at what we call slums, or the Kacha city, or Kachi Abadis, and however they're favelas, they are victims of standards, right? Because we've deemed materials like that as being kacha, and therefore not permanent, and therefore not worthy of being acknowledged as habitation, right? That comes from the code. That dichotomy and that binary is the result of the code. When you go to rural India, it's all kacha materials, mud walls with tile roofs and GI sheets or whatever it might be. And so so if we begin to imagine cities as cities, as part of this weird imagination of the world-class city or the global city, and everything is a building built in concrete and goes high-rise, of course it excludes people, because you can't build like that. Everyone can't build like that. But they're victims of the code. But if you ratified it and said we're going to make mud walls and tiled roofs part of the code, and you can build in a city of Mumbai like that, people will start improving their homes because they won't be illegal any longer, correct? So it's
I think that's already happening to a certain context, right? The return of the natural material, whether it's in building, whether it's in craft, there is a kind of like a resurgence of natural weaving techniques, traditional techniques. So there is a kind of call back to that. But yes, maybe there needs to be a larger awareness, or not just a call back for the purpose of said, oh, mud is cool again, or a certain kind of weave, or making cotton or khadi or khaki cool again, right? So how do you maybe improve on the awareness of not just for the factor that it is in trend, but there could be a long-term, long-sustaining effect? How do you work towards that as a corporate entity and as a creative professional, as an architect who provides solutions?
So I'll start by saying context matters, right? The context in terms of geography, earthquake-prone zones versus not stable, tropical, arid, context matters in its complete kind of imaginary, right? The form of the city matters, right? If you have to look at the relevance of material. For example, it's linked to economy. Mumbai, if we are forcing through our FSI, FAR, whatever that definition is, everyone into high-rise buildings, how many contractors can do a building over 15 floors? Even in a city like Mumbai, you won't be able to come up with more than 100, right? But if you have a low-rise, high-density city like New Bombay was imagined, where land was opened up and you had ground and one-story buildings, you'd have 10,000 contractors who can do that, which means the spread in the economy is massive. It's not centralized, correct? So the form of the city is very critical, because then that's linked to what are the crafts and what are the materials you can use. So the way we imagine the form of our city and then codify them through policy and standards limits who can participate in their existence in the city, in their participation in the economy of the city. So these two are very closely linked. One is the broader context in which something is situated and the choices that are made as a result of that, and then more specifically the form of the city. You can have a high-rise, high-density city, Singapore, Dubai. If 4 contractors, 5 contractors, no one else is equipped to build it, right? You have 5 developers because no one can put capital like that, correct? You have Singapore, etc., same paradigm. Or you can have a city which is a low-rise, high-density city. Thousands of people can participate in its construction, right? Which is what the slums demonstrate. Everyone makes their own houses, or you have petty contractors who do little tasks. It's a great spread of the economy. So these are all linked, and this comes back to the interconnectedness, that none of these decisions can be imagined in isolation. It's all interconnected. The culture of a place, its economy, what emanates from that is a political ideology. And that's why architecture is the barometer for society. Architecture and the form of our cities actually the best barometer for the aspirations of that society. You know, the way a city treats its poor is the read. The future is going to, history is going to read cities by the way they treated their poor, you know. And, you know, look at Mumbai, for example, the kind of what the great anthropologist Arjun Appadurai calls the weapons of mass construction. The highways, the freeways, all of that's being made for about 5% of the population, right? It's completely wrong in terms of investment, but that's the aspiration of the people in power today that are perpetuating that kind of paradigm. So these are very interconnected issues.
And I think also another important aspect is, you know, climate change, especially a city like Mumbai, for instance, that has so much coastline, susceptibility to flooding, and increasingly we are seeing much more erratic weather. So, you know, how do we really build spaces also taking the future into consideration that may be quite different from the present, and how do we really build for that, and is it possible to really build for the future? But I think that is something that we should be thinking about.
Very much, you know, and I think that's probably the most critical question today. And having said that, even climate change, how do you break it down into action, right? And people are reacting in 2 ways to this. And this is the literature that exists, so it's not my original thought. One is people are buffering themselves against climate change, like Manhattan is doing, building big walls. How do I read that? I read that as very intense capital, spending more capital to protect itself, right? Of course, the more logical way to approach this is through managed retreat. Get onto higher land, which is what animals do. That's natural instinct, right? In Mumbai, we have an amazing opportunity to reimagine the city by looking at the metropolitan region once again and retreating and pausing. I'll come back. And that's why I said something like that house could be a fantastic center to make people aware of climate change. So when they cross the harbor and they reach the other side and they're in untouched terrain, that center tells them what could happen here. We could even make images of filling them in Photoshop with high-rise buildings, and this is what you want to happen here. You can create amazing awareness, because the only way Mumbai is going to save itself from climate change is through managed retreat, because everything in the hinterland or the metropolitan area is much higher land, right? So that whole new imaginary. Pause, come back. That was just for her on the side. So the other way to deal with climate change is managed retreat, which is the most logical way to do it. But then that means a much longer time durée in terms of an imaginary, correct? We can't then rely on the myopia of our politicians and policymakers who are looking at 3- and 5-year election cycles. Then you need to have projections that look at 15 years, and that's where time as an instrument of imagination becomes very important. If you think of it in the context of climate change, a thought that comes to mind, which is also unsettling for younger designers and for the next generation, is that in today's world around the globe, which is unlike ever in history. The past has become unsettled and the future has become very precise. We know in 12 years the temperature is going to change by 2 degrees. We have the scientific data for that. Yeah. And everything of the past is being re-questioned and repackaged by politicians, by historians, and other histories that got left out of the story are coming back. History is being distorted. So suddenly, for our generation, we are sitting at a point in 2023, right? And we're looking at a past we don't understand because, we are told this is an incorrect history, or a politician is telling us, and we know what's going to happen in 10 years. And so the urgency to act on the issues you're describing of climate change are immense.
Yeah. And it's also strange and sometimes terrifying that climate change is dismissed as it's not happening, or it's not happening, and it's not going to affect the long-term growth, or it's not going to affect the long-term plans that are part of authoritative process. So just wondering here, like again, what is the role of again the corporate? What is the role again of the creative in terms of strengthening the awareness of the consumer, in terms of not just making smarter decisions, but a lot more conscious decisions. So maybe Nyrika, if you want to add in here by saying that how does the corporate entity ensure that the responsibility? I mean, we talked about responsive action too. How do you kind of enforce that in whatever way that you can, not just by making products, like for instance your recycled concrete slabs, for instance, but also through product, whatever you're selling. How do you reinforce responsive action and responsibility for your consumers?
Yeah, I do believe that corporates must play a role in shaping preferences, and I think it's a responsibility that is important to carry forward. But I don't think it can be done in isolation, and I think that strengthening public-private partnerships to be able to do it effectively. For instance, we can look at, say, LED lights and how it's now become ubiquitous. Yeah. And the adoption really was precipitated by the government through incentives. And then, that was able to kind of influence corporates to really shape behavior. And I think that's a really nice paradigm of being able to work together, because clearly corporates in isolation cannot do much. The sphere of influence, as you said, is limited in that sense. But if we can come together, I think then, and of course, civil society being a very important consumer of services, of goods, I think that kind of relationship, working together, how do we strengthen that? How do we, build together? I think that's something that maybe we need to do more effectively.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, again, 2 responses to what her thoughts had triggered off. One is, I think the example you give of the LED lights is a very good one, because sustainability, climate change, these are such large rubrics that they only expand your sphere of concern and diminish your sphere of influence. Because, sustainability could be everything, climate change could be everything. So I think the role we can play as entrepreneurs, as designers, is how we break them down into action, right? Into components that can cumulatively aggregate to have that impact. And I think, one can think about materials, one can think about energy, one can think about specifics. And I believe there's not enough effort given in that direction of breaking climate, because climate change as a rubric it's actually frightening, yes, but it's also comfortable in terms of a rhetoric, right? It doesn't commit you to anything. You just get more ghabraud in a sense, right? But how one breaks it down from our perspectives of disciplines into actionable tasks, which then aggregate in some way, going back to your idea of consciousness where they get interconnected, could make them effective. Yeah, yeah. The other point I think she kind of highlighted in passing, but I think it's a very important point, is civil society and how that can play a role. And I think that is going to be very important for the future. I personally believe that the greatest constituency, let's use the word client, for designers in the future is going to be civil society. And how do you define civil society? Civil society is that part of society that actually has a pulse for the grassroots, but has the wherewithal to negotiate with more powerful forces, right? And so, for example, NGOs that play advocacy roles for slum dwellers have a pulse of the grassroots, but can negotiate with the World Bank and the state government. I would think trade unions, which is a diminishing and a fading entity, is an example of civil society, because they have the pulse for the workers if they are well intentioned, and they have the power to negotiate with the more powerful forces, the owners of a business, etc. And that bridge society, which is civil society, I think we should pay much more attention to cull what might be ways of creating greater consciousness.
All right. I personally, from the side of the conversation, I'm really enjoying how this arc has been created so far. We've talked about the two spheres of influence and concern. We've talked about interconnectedness between communities, between entrepreneurs, between creative professionals, and between authorities as well. To forward the conversation, let's talk about what is this concept of global cities. I think from our observations, from news, from even a convergence of not just politics, given that we had G20 hosted in Bombay, or the Olympics Committee being hosted in a capital city in India, how is the concept of global city, whether the concept of a global city is contributing to the narrative of consciousness, or is it fighting against the narrative of consciousness when you talk about interconnectedness, or when you talk about influence and concern? What do you think should be the concept of a global city, and where does India factor in? I mean, you talk about this a lot in your writing as well, where you talk about how building an equitable and sustainable city is two opposing political rhetorics. Is it possible to elaborate on this a little further, and how this ties in with our narrative of interconnectedness, of building a conscious society? Yeah.
To put it in a simple way, cities grew out as the result of managing the surplus of the countryside, right? Cities started off with a few farmers getting together on a Sunday to sell their goods. Then people stayed there. You had middlemen, and they built their houses there. The city accumulated, and its pinnacle was the city beautiful, Vienna, etc., where the city became a static entity, and who accumulated the wealth were all the people who were managing the surplus of the countryside, not making the surplus of the countryside, but managing it, right? And they became patrons of music and architecture and all of that. Jump to the 20th century, 21st, post-industrialization. Cities began to then become places, or the global city as an idea became a place that managed the capital, the wealth, from everywhere around the globe, right? You had the global city. Before that, you had the world city, which was about managing political power, right? London was a world city, New York was a world city. Then you had the notion of a global city, which was managing capital. And people like Saskia Sassen and other economists invented these sort of ideas, rubrics. And the global city it's a contradictory kind of term, because Dublin was a global city because it managed capital, but Mumbai wasn't a global city, even though it was 14 million people, because it didn't have that accumulated capital that Dublin had for a moment in time. So it really, the way I see global cities are cities where capital parks and is managed, and what results from it, because cities and architecture is really a manifestation of the aspiration of the place, they become what I call the landscapes of impatient capital. And the architecture they produce is the architecture of impatient capital, which is what we see in a city like Mumbai. It's capital wanting to realize its value very quickly. And the places that can allow capital to land comfortably and manifest themselves quickly become the most sort of desired places, the Shanghais, the Dubais, the Singapores. Mumbai, poor thing, struggles with this because it's full of frictions to realize capital here.
Yeah.
And so these are global cities, and their aspiration is very centric on capital, on the individual. It comes from a capitalistic world. It has no time or energy or patience for humanity in a sense, and this is one end of the spectrum, and this is what is happening here. The other end of the spectrum is the communist and the socialist city, which has also failed, where it was the human being that was centric to every decision, right? It was a flattened hierarchical system.
Yeah.
And the problem is that we don't find our solutions in extremes, we have to find middle ground. And therefore, both these paradigms are simultaneously valid, but we haven't bought the imaginations to make a city that could accommodate both of them. And that's part of, I think, the crisis that we deal with.
Right, yeah, yeah.
And also I think the idea of, because a lot of the way that, say, cities develop is also maybe copy pasting in a sense from other cities, and how do we, in say a city like Bombay, build something which is very authentically Indian and has that sensibility and is not just a copy paste of a city like Dubai, or and how do we do that in a meaningful way?
So, like the impatience of capital, I mean, the other way to explain this is the tyranny of images, right? Dubai wants to be like Houston, and then Singapore wants to be like Dubai, and Shanghai wants to be like Singapore, and Mumbai then wants to be like Shanghai, and then Nasik wants to be like Mumbai, and then the village near Nasik wants to be like Nasik. So it's a tyranny of images and completely out of sync with the context and what might be actually appropriate. So what are the examples of this middle ground? And I say this not only in the context of our conversation, but I truly mean it. You look at company towns, the township in Vikhroli, for example. It's balancing capitalism with social concerns, right? It's creating amenities, it's creating housing. I think Jamshedpur does that. So in India, the examples of this combination of the kind of capitalist drive to create an economy and the socialist impulse to create equity occurs in company towns in very beautiful ways. And that's why when we go to company towns, we say, how beautiful is an environment, there's a Maidan, there's a school, they're all the components.
Yeah.
So if you think about a city, I think there are 4 components that make a city, and how we calibrate those balances are very important. Yeah? The first is dwelling. I'm not using the word housing, I'm saying dwelling, how people dwell. The second is livelihoods, what gives them their income, right? Then you have the question of mobility, that's transportation. When we had the shop house, mobility was one flight of stairs. It was inelastic, but it worked, right? As our cities grow, mobility becomes very elastic, right? And so therefore, cities that have a good mobility system can actually create and sustain relationships between places of livelihood and places of dwelling, and people can go back and forth and it works. And that's why they say the best form of subsidy on housing is subsidizing transportation. If you make that easy and comfortable, you've actually subsidized housing. And then the fourth of this holy trinity, the fourth you would add is amenities, which is schools, hospitals, what you might call social infrastructure. And so a place that can create those balances is what makes a livable, an equitable, and a good environment, which is what I think we should all as human beings aspire to. Now, I think a company town does exactly that. I'm talking about the Indian paradigm, and something like Mumbai is a complete disaster on all those counts. Right? I would say livelihoods exist here, that's why people are here, but mobility is not yet elastic enough, and dwelling is a complete disaster, and amenities are a complete disaster. So you see that imbalance. And the cities and the towns, the settlements that can balance these 4 and think of them strategically and make decisions that are based on creating and calibrating those 4 are the great cities of the day.
What Nyrika also mentioned is important to revisit, where you were talking about how in a rush to build a city that is globally accepted, there is a dilution of its roots. There is a dilution of that city's identity. And there is a question mark about what really makes a place and its identity authentic. Perhaps you all can comment on that, right? How do we how do we then define or redefine what makes a place truly authentic, and how do we educate that, especially with collaborators, especially with authorities and support and the support system? So perhaps maybe Nyrika, if you want to comment on this a little bit, and then Rahul can.
No, I think, Rahul, the point that you made on values, I feel that is the foundation, because what are the values that we value, and what are how are they informing, as you rightly said, the way that we live, and also in terms of slums and the rehabilitation of slums and people living living on the ground and then having to live vertical, kind of also changing the way of living, the lifestyle, and how do we factor for that? Because clearly that is also causing dissonance and maybe in a sense dictating how one ought to live. And I think, again, that is, as you rightly said, a collaboration of stakeholders to really create a vision and what it means, and also celebrating who we are and not forgetting about that. Absolutely. And I think, as you rightly said, dwellings are a very essential and critical part of our identity and who we are and how we live. And it's important to be able to celebrate that and not forget it.
Yes, absolutely. And values is critical because it's linked to identity. So what is identity? Identity is actually what we identify with. So therefore it's the values we identify with, right? And that's why identity is constructed. Our identity is being constructed as we speak. Identity is not what you excavate and find. That would be a complete mistake. Every generation constructs its identity. Look at India. We had, under Gandhi, we had an identity because we as a nation were identifying with that set of values. And that has completely changed. And look at the kind of values we're identifying with today and the dissonance that's creating in the environment, because that's our identity today. Let's not fool ourselves. That's our identity, and it's not one, I think, at least I don't feel even comfortable with. I wish I could construct another identity. So I think values is what leads to identity, and what you identify with in terms of value is what informs the built environment. And that's why the built environment design generally is an incredibly important barometer of the aspiration of that society, because they're aspiring to a certain set of values which is constructing their identity. And these are all kind of linked. And that's why consciousness, coming back to that, I think, very robust category that you've constructed, is quite critical, because it's only through that consciousness of being interconnected, that consciousness of what are the values that would be good for this planet, will emerge our identity, and we will collectively construct it.
Right.
So, I mean, again, just going back to a company town, or what I know of Vikhroli and the values that come with it, it was about creating a particular work culture and value, which then informed what were the amenities, what were the kinds of dwellings which were related to livelihood, right? So that relationship is critical. I just wanted to make that point. But
absolutely. I mean, you talked about identifiers and how our built environment is the strongest global identifier. I personally feel that another identifier for India, a global identifier, is its craft. And we're already seeing that, right, with the marriage of Dior and, Chanakya School through its embroidery and craft, or for that matter, a lot of our brands that are rooted in craft seeing international appeal, whether it's doing collaborations with designers or whether it's through like setting up stores, etc. I wanted to get your input on what are your thoughts of revitalizing traditional art and craft for the purpose of current context? And does that factor in with building techniques as well, with traditional methods as well? What are your thoughts on revitalizing for current problem solutions as well, solving for problems of current context?
So I want to start by a cautionary note, which is that I think we have to be careful about fetishizing material. A fetish is something where you feel comfortable with, right? A fetish is about comfort. It's really about creating comfort. And I think I put a word of caution to my profession that don't fetishize material, because it creates an illusion of the comfort and the support for crafts. crafts have to be linked to economies of what is being produced, right? And so therefore, I think at least within architecture, you have experiments with craft that happen in Alibag or in small towns or in Pondicherry or in what I almost call isolated utopian settings where you can do this. On the other hand, someone like Laurie Baker, unconscious of aesthetics in some way, I mean, he did develop a lovely aesthetic, but sometimes there were turrets that were, dissonant in that landscape, was giving the craftsmen the respect to do what they had to do. His drawings were intentions. They weren't superly controlled working drawings. They were intentions of what he wanted, and he had faith in the craftspeople. I think that makes the paradigm shift. I don't, and this is again something I'm saying on camera and critical of, I find my colleagues who celebrate craft and talk about craftsmanship, I've never seen them mention the name of a craftsman or even give them credit when all those things appear in fancy magazines, right? They seem to take the credit for it, and what they're doing is really unleashing craft, right? I think I'm being critical in a productive way, because I think unless we have faith in craft, unless we support and nurture craft in the right place at the right time. So, for example, context makes a big difference. The context of where material of a particular kind, a craftsmanship of a particular kind is perpetuated, nourished, is very critical. We've got to create the context for that. We can't just say, okay, let's do things in this material, that makes no sense. I would think building a building in concrete is a craft if you have to do it in Mumbai. So it is an attitude. It is a form of consciousness. It is a form of realizing what is contextually right and what is that ecology you construct to nurture that craft, not to look at it in isolation in terms of material per se. And so this critical view of craft is, I think, going to be critical for the future of craft and how it is situated within the broader economy. Finally, it's economy. People have to get their livelihoods of doing something, and how we find that appropriate balance is the trick, I think.
Yeah. If you don't mind me asking, you've hit the nail at the head in terms of giving credit to where credit is due. I actually wanted to ask you this one small question about, you are also an educator, right? You educate architects and designers too. I wanted to understand from you, how do you transfer this consciousness or this awareness, about say responsibility, accountability, and ensuring that an architect's role is not just about realizing your own vision. It is realizing your vision through meaningful collaboration. So I just wanted to kind of, if you can just touch upon that as well, right? The role of education and creating this, transferring this consciousness. If you can just maybe talk about that.
It's not a small question.
Because I'm an educator, so the reason why I'm asking this, I'm an educator as well.
So I will use this as a segue to bring just one more aspect in. So I think for me as an educator, and what I think I would like to transfer, primarily is this notion that context matters, right? And when we teach architects, we talk about context, I believe, in very simplistic ways. We talk about the climate, what is the geography of the place, the materials available, maybe the culture. When we get more ambitious, we excavate histories and say, look, there were other histories here, how can you surface them? But let's get even more ambitious, and we should ask the question, what is the context of our context? So imagine your context nestled in a bigger context, and then it's geopolitics, it's the Dalit movement, it's inequities, it's social justice, and therefore how do you then become aware, conscious of your context in an understanding as an architect within a broader and it is at those moments where that understanding of the physical manifestations, the tangible manifestations of a context that intersect with the intangible manifestations, that's where in that intersection lie the most important moments of intervention and thinking about things, about being empathetic to society, finding new ways of defining the problem, questioning standards, right? So for me, that complicating that context is a way to challenge students. And I believe very much that in today's world, if you're confused, it just means you're thinking clearly. My students who think they're very clear about what they do, I said, poor fellow is confused, right? Because we have to be confused to create those moments where we can be ambitious enough to intervene. So that's one aspect in terms of my approach to pedagogy. And the other is questioning time. I believe, and I'm critical of this, that in the profession we have no way of dealing with time. And the provocation I make is, when we think of a building, are we making a permanent solution for a temporary problem? You know, the planet is in flux. And that's also linked to material choices, right? So when we make weekend homes, you know, we make weekend homes like they're going to last for 400 years. And then we are a young couple when we do that. Our kids enjoy it till they're teenagers. After that, they won't have anything to do with their parents. They don't even show up in the weekend house, correct? And then you're left not knowing what to do. You either sell it, that's a good sustainable approach. But could we design a weekend home just for 20 years? Could we bring time into our imagination? That will determine the materials we use. We might then use bamboo, and then the industry of bamboo might get the traction it needs to create these reversible solutions, right? So time becomes a very important component in our imaginary in the world today to be able to make those choices. It's linked even to our material choices. And why should we use a particular kind of material? Why are we obsessed with the notion of permanence? You know, I mean, I grew up in a city like Mumbai, people pointing buildings and saying, that was built to last for 500 years. Now I'm wondering, why the hell was it built to last for 500 years, correct? I mean, look at climate change, look at what changes. We were talking about Mandwa earlier. I mean, who would have imagined what happened there? Why were we investing in artifacts like maybe the shacks were the right solution, where with the palm leaves they could be dismantled? Time is going to be very critical as we go into the future.
Thank you for sharing that. Speaking of time and timeless structures, we are in a timeless building of sorts. Can you maybe, Nyrika, if you can talk about the permanence and the vision behind the building that we're sitting in today, and how it best represents what we've been talking about so far, the interconnectedness, conscious action, collective action. Can you maybe share your anecdotes on this?
No, I think the point that you brought up, Rahul, about time and how do we really look at structures from a impermanent perspective. I think it's a very difficult dichotomy. I'm just trying to think about it in my own context, that it's very difficult to do, because at the start of any project you would want something to last, and I think it's difficult to think about it in that way. And you know, also reflecting on this building, which has endured for many generations of our family, and you know, I always have memories of Godrej Bhavan as a place where people came together or come together, and you know, diverse perspectives, people from different walks of life coming together, having conversations on the terrace. And I think that whole idea of community, of discussions, of, you know, thought-provoking conversations, I think that really is the spirit of the building. And I think also the importance of energy, I think increasingly so, how we are looking at energy and how we're looking at the way that we live. Whether it's, you know, the way that buildings are constructed, the way that you know, we generate heat, the way that cooling happens, how do we reduce energy, or at least be aware of our energy consumption, and you know, which also comes down to things like appliances, which, say, a country like India today, if we're looking at air conditioners and heating patterns, given very, very low penetration of 2%, and how that is increasingly going to grow given the demands of cooling in the future, and how do we really create solutions that are going to be energy efficient and have less of an impact. I think all of these are very important in the structures that we build. How do we, in a sense, if they are to be more permanent, how do we reduce their footprint on the city and our own ability to consume less, because it's such a one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gases.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I think that's beautifully said, and what it makes me think about is, while I was creating these provocations about impermanence, my career for the first 15 years was largely conservation of buildings, right? So I was trying to reinforce the permanence, but I think with the same perspective that she was describing, which is that how can you reuse them, because there's embodied energy, and how can you, so it was really, for me in retrospect, what one was trying to do was to not be obsessed with preservation and what is the significance of this building, and we should reinforce that significance, but the idea of how you can construct a new significance. It's like constructing identity. And really what we did with the Kala Ghoda area and things was constructed a new identity by bringing a festival and new meaning to it in terms of what the contemporary engines are that could drive this process of keeping the embodied energy of these buildings intact. And reuse becomes a very critical aspect of this whole conversation. To come to this building, I think for me, the Godrej Bhavan is a very, very important building in the city for multiple reasons. One is, I think, just from the perspective of its design articulation. It is a building that is very clearly stratified, which is a base which is retail, which is very transparent, porous, welcoming. A substructure which is very neutral. It's nuanced, it's articulated, but it's ambiguous. It could be, it could be a warehouse, because it doesn't tell me much. It could be an office, it could be residence. It's quiet, it's neutral, it's ambiguous. And then it was the first building in the city that used the roof plane as effectively as it did, which was a green roof. It was a garden with beautiful trees, actually, almost a marker from across the Maidan. And so what it did was two things for me growing up, and I've known this building since I was, I think, 14 or 12 or 14, and I'll tell you at a more personal level how. But it was a building that did two things. One is it is truly urban in my view, because it embraces multiple uses, right? It's not monofunctional in the way it has been imagined. But more importantly, and this is where I think I can speak from personal experiences, it is truly urban because it creates a range of associations. It's a building that triggers and generates multiple associations. So I can associate with this building as someone who's consuming retail. I can associate with this building as someone who has to come to meet people in the Godrej organization. I can associate with this building because the Godrej family supports NGOs and civil societies that I come to meet, someone from the Indian Heritage Society or someone who's worrying about vultures in the city, etc. And I have a whole set of associations with those meetings. I can associate with being dragged here as a 14-year-old by my father, who was in the machine tool business and was involved with the Imtex machine tool show, that he was coming here for meetings because the Godrej Vikhroli facility was being used for that. I can associate with this building coming for wonderful receptions to meet visiting scholars, museum directors on the terrace. So the associations one has with this building, and I'm sure there must be many other 100 people who have these similar associations, is what makes the building urban. An urban building is one that has the ability, as Aldo Rossi, the famous architect critic, wrote about the architecture of the city. They are buildings that can take on new meaning with time. They can take on new energies, new associations, new uses, and they can generate a multiplicity of associations with them. That's what makes buildings really urban. Now, you can have a church that does that, although it's monofunctional, but it's very difficult for secular buildings to do that. And I think Godrej Bhavan is a building that does that very successfully.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you for sharing that.
I think, a particular incident doesn't come to mind right now, but I mean, as you rightly touched upon the terrace is really the centerpiece of the building, and it was just a space where you know, people came together, and completely different walks of life, and completely different topics of conversation. I just always remember sitting under the trees, and you know, friends of mine asked, you know, why do you always hang out with your parents? I said, because my parents' friends are very interesting, and you always you just meet very interesting people and get enlightened. So not a particular incidence, but just a flurry of memories and yeah, good times.
You know, I mean, I think coming back to the idea of consciousness,
Yeah.
I think one shift we have to make, and this affects our cities, because I think our cities are being affected badly by myopic attitudes, where people are using a myopic vision, which is very individual centric for now. And I think one way to make this shift to consciousness and awareness, a sense of interconnectedness, is to not think about our generation and us and what we need now, but to think about what people might need a generation or two down. That's the greatest gift we can give our children, but finally, it's the only way we can actually make our talk walk when we talk about creating a more conscious society and letting that influence the built environment design and other aspects of life.
Yeah, lovely. Thank
3
you.
minutes, finish.
Thank you. Thank you.